Newcastle United are spending £190 million on a training ground, which sounds completely unreasonable until you look at what the figure actually covers. When somebody says training ground, I picture a few pitches beside a building where players eat pasta and pretend the manager's tactical meeting is fascinating. Newcastle's plan is much bigger. The club have agreed to buy the 260-acre Woolsington Hall estate near Newcastle Airport, restore the historic site, and build an elite performance complex there. The first team could move in for the 2029-30 season, if planning permission and construction go as expected. The academy is included in the wider plan, with enough flexibility to add dedicated facilities for the women's and girls' teams. All of that sits inside the reported £190 million scheme. Fair enough, but why put that much money into a place where footballers practice, when the same amount could buy several players? Newcastle's takeover created a strange situation. Saudi Arabia's Public Investment Fund became the majority owner in 2021, giving the club access to one of the wealthiest ownership groups in sport. Supporters then discovered that having an extremely rich owner and being allowed to build an extremely expensive squad are different things. The Premier League squad cost ratio rules connect spending on wages, transfer amortisation, and agent fees to the club's football income and player sale results. The domestic threshold is 85%, while clubs playing in UEFA competitions also have to deal with UEFA's tighter 70% limit. PIF's wider wealth does not become Newcastle revenue simply because the chairman opens a banking app. Newcastle still earn considerably less than the Premier League's biggest commercial machines, so their squad allowance remains smaller. This is how a club backed by Saudi billions can reach a transfer window and start calculating which player might need to leave before another one arrives. The training ground decision begins to make sense once you understand where the financial restriction is actually applied. Infrastructure sits outside the squad cost calculation that controls wages and transfer spending. The owners can fund a major training complex without using the allowance Newcastle need for players, although the project still consumes real cash and appears in the club's accounts. The regulations treat the project as a long-term asset that could serve Newcastle for decades. Newcastle have already improved their current Benton base and submitted plans for more work there. At some point, though, repeated upgrades become an expensive way of protecting the limitations of the original site. This is familiar to anybody who works in software. A company asks you to test a new feature, then you discover the feature has been attached to an old system with 17 patches and one service nobody understands because the developer left in 2019. Management insists it is a small change. QA opens the first screen and immediately finds a field called Status 32. You can keep patching it, and sometimes that is the sensible short-term decision, but eventually rebuilding gives you control over the whole system. Woolsington is Newcastle's rebuild. A modern performance center affects almost every working day of the season. Medical staff can design recovery spaces around the players instead of adapting whatever rooms are available. Coaches can have pitches built for their methods, while the academy can operate close enough to the first team for the pathway to feel real, rather than appearing in a club statement once a year. Recruitment changes as well. If Newcastle are asking an elite player or a highly rated teenager to choose them over an established Champions League club, the facilities become physical evidence of where the project is going. A transfer signing improves the team for the length of one contract. The training ground keeps working through hundreds of contracts and several managers. The size of the project also explains why the price has climbed so high. Woolsington includes a listed country house and parkland that have been in poor condition for years. Newcastle must work around heritage protections, restore parts of the estate, and create the access needed for a daily football operation. Then, the club has to build a performance center and develop the pitches across a site larger than many people expected. Former Newcastle owner Sir John Hall bought Woolsington Hall in 1994 because he hoped the estate could eventually house the club's academy. More than 30 years later, that idea has returned with a much larger budget and a different ownership group. The available land gives Newcastle room to shape each phase around the club's growth. The first team and academy can receive purpose-built areas from the beginning. Facilities for the women's program can be integrated when that part of the plan is ready, rather than being squeezed into whatever corner remains. Space sounds boring until a club runs out of it. Then every expansion becomes another meeting where somebody says, "Can we just move this wall?" And QA has to explain that the wall is somehow connected to payments. Newcastle are trying to avoid building that kind of football club. Their latest published annual turnover was £335.3 million, which is substantial. Yet several rivals they want to catch generate more than twice as much. Income-based regulations make that gap powerful. The established clubs can afford larger squads because years of success have already given them greater commercial revenue. Newcastle need a better system for developing talent and convincing commercial partners that the club belongs at the top level. Woolsington cannot create that growth on its own, but it gives the football operation somewhere capable of supporting it. The £190 million is therefore a long bet on what Newcastle might become. A player bought for the same headline fee would give supporters an immediate moment to celebrate, followed by wages and the quiet terror of wondering whether his hamstring can survive English winter. Woolsington offers a slower return. The club gains a permanent base that should improve its daily work and help the academy produce players who either strengthen the team or generate transfer income. It also gives PIF and the Reuben ownership group somewhere useful to deploy capital, while squad spending remains tied to Newcastle's own revenue. None of this guarantees trophies. Expensive buildings cannot fix poor recruitment, and a hydrotherapy pool has never marked Erling Haaland at a corner. Newcastle will still need good decisions and enough patience to let the project develop. That patience may be the hardest part, because football supporters can understand £80 million spent on a winger immediately. He plays on Saturday, and everybody decides by halftime whether he was worth it. A training ground takes years before anyone can judge the effect, and even then, its contribution is mixed into player development and injury management away from the cameras. Newcastle are spending £190 million because the financial rules allow their owners to build the club more freely than they can build the squad. The project addresses something the takeover money could never solve with one signing. Newcastle's football infrastructure was still operating below the level of the teams they wanted to compete against. Woolsington is their attempt to close that gap permanently. Calling it a training ground makes the price sound ridiculous, because the phrase is too small for what they intend to build. It is supposed to become the working headquarters of a future superclub. Now, Newcastle have to prove that the football can eventually match the building. That's it. That's all I have. Bye-bye.